Okay, Joe, you're now live.
Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the June meeting of Gloucestershire Schools Forum. First of all, can I ask if there are any apologies for absence?
Yes, apologies received from Alison Berry, Stephen Dean, Elisa Entwistle, Julia Maunder, Becky Martin, Dermot McNiff, and David Williams.
Okay.
And Joe Bleasdale, I can see you're in attendance. Joe is subbing for Becky Martin.
Okay, thank you. There are no new members attending this meeting, but Alex Cowson, who is from the Education Skills Funding Agency, is observing the meeting. The next item is the election of Vice Chair. So this position has become vacant. Becky Martin has confirmed that she is, I don't know, keen, willing, or has been persuaded, delete where applicable, to stand as Vice Chair. Can I ask if there are any other nominations for the post of Vice Chair? Okay, so if I propose Becky, is there anybody who could second that proposal, please?
Yeah.
Thank you, Lynn.
Both of us.
Or Claire.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. So Becky Martin unfortunately can't be with us for this meeting, but she will be here in September in her capacity as Vice Chair. Can we now have a look at the minutes from the last meeting, please, which was on 30th of March. So we could first go through them fairly quickly for any items of accuracy. So in terms of the attendance list, that's no issues with that. Okay, good. So go into page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, 7, and 8. Okay, so in terms of the action points, the main item was the specification for the children and family centres. So Phil, do you want to, I know there's a fair number of pages in the papers dealing with this. Is there anything you want to say about this just now?
Well, yeah, just I guess two things. Firstly, we shared the draft specification for family hubs and children family centres. It's going through draft at this stage, so there's an opportunity for people to do that and let us have any feedback you want to. If you want to do that offline, I recognise it's quite a long document and you might have some detailed feedback you want to provide, but I'm also secondly happy to take any kind of comments or thoughts about it here if anybody's got anything they want to raise particularly now. But if you want to provide feedback offline, then we've provided a link there to the right person to be able to do that to inform the shape of that specification.
Okay. Does anybody have any comments or questions about the document? Okay, thank you very much. And then the other action point was the feedback from the F40 executive briefing, which has been shared already. So that is completed. Okay. All right. So can we now move on to item 6, which is the 21-22 outturn and maintain school balances. I think this is back again to you, Phil.
Yeah. Okay. Do we just need to check whether there are any public questions?
I do beg your pardon. We do.
Sorry,
Were there any public questions, Joe?
No, none received.
Okay, sorry.
I thought that might be the case, but just so I check. Okay, so no. Right. Okay. Now I'm going to share my screen. Take you through presentation.
Sorry, Phil. Before you carry on, I also omitted to ask about declarations of public interest.
Sorry, yeah, I haven't received any notification of it.
Okay, All right, apologies for that. Sorry, Phil, yes, back to you.
Okay. In the pack, we've provided some details around the 21-22 outturn maintained school balances. So this is the dedicated schools grant outturn. All I've done in the slides is just pick out some of the kind of key information here. I was just going to kind of draw your attention to some of the key points. There's a recommendation at the end, and then if there are any questions, comments, or thoughts about it. So the table in the pack here that I've got on the screen, this presented the outturn of the whole dedicated schools grant for this last financial year. And what it was basically showing was a £594,000 underspend in the schools block. And that, again, it goes on to say the detail of that. There are two parts to that. There was an underspend of £456,000 on the growth fund, which is used to fund new schools and the increases in basic need places. So we didn't need as much of that as we put aside. And there was a small £138,000 underspend in the dedelegated balances. And those are the dedelegations that the maintained schools put aside to support a variety of different functions. There was in the pack a breakdown of those dedelegated balances. So at the end of the year, we were 594,000 underspent in the schools block. The high needs block came in at 6.9 million overspent. I'm not going to spend any time on that right now because there's a much more detailed view of the high needs position and later on the agenda. But our final position there was 6.9. For those that remember, we'd set out the year aiming for just around about a £4 million overspend, and over the course of the year that rose. Like I say, we'll go into the details of that later. Early years, there's a 1.3 million underspend in there. That's usual at this time of the year. There's a lag in the way that funding is provided in the early years sector based on the timing of census data, etc. But we do tend to get to this point of the year, and later in the year, there may well be a surplus. And as we did last year, we'd make decisions later in the year around how we reallocate that, because it is early years block funding there. So overall, final block, just a small £35,000 overspend in the central services block there. So overall, what that was telling us was a net DSG deficit carried forward of just over 17 million and £42,000. So that outturn from this year effectively creates that kind of £17 million position. I guess the next slide, which shows the kind of cumulative position over the year. So again, this was in the pack. Early years, so including that 1 million from this year, there's also a carried forward amount from the previous year. Now, at the last forum, we agreed that we were going to reallocate that into, and it was approved to go into hourly rates. So there's a 2.8 million current report around surplus balances in early years, but 1.4 of that has been agreed, ready to go forward into early years hourly rates. Feedback there, sorry. The cumulative de-delegated position, so we had 138,000 underspend this year. There was a carry forward of 200,000, so we've currently got a £338,000 surplus in the de-delegated balances there. Again, there was a breakdown of that in the pack. I haven't replicated it on the slides, but it's in the pack, which ultimately means when you look at all of these kind of balances carry forward, the actual real deficit, because these are ring fenced effectively. So the early years balance, whilst it's offsetting the kind of current overall deficit position down to 17 million, as you can see on the screen, it's 17.043 million. The true deficit balance really we would consider would be 20.2, and that is in all senses high needs, as you'll be aware. So these early years and the de-delegated, they're ring fenced and effectively will need, would be spent in those areas at some stage, even though there's a balance there. So that's our overall position. There was detail in the pack around this. I'm going to pause there. The recommendation is that we agree this as the deficit 21-22 is earmarked as above. But happy to take any questions, comments, thoughts about that part of the report.
Does anybody have any questions at all? In that case, can we just move on to the recommendation itself? Are there any members who would want to vote against that recommendation? Okay, in that case, we can take it that the school forum approves that recommendation. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. So I'll move on to the second part then. So the second part of that first report looks at the balances in maintained schools. Just to give you an overview of the changes this year. And on the slide, I've identified some of the key messages there. So revenue balances across maintained schools increased by 3.3 million. That was up 17.8%. The capital balances also increased 84 there. So a small amount on the capital side. There was a removal of 0.34 as well. That was relating to 7 academy conversions. So adjustments made for that. Overall, total balance in the maintained school sector is around 23.3 million. Sounds like a lot, but actually across the number of schools, the majority of those balances are working within the 5 to 8% window that we recommend. So our school's financial handbook suggests that all schools should be looking to retain somewhere between 5 to 8%, depending on the phase of the sector they're in. There are a number of schools where small number where balances are slightly higher than that. We are proposing to kind of write to people as an outcome from this meeting, from this outturn, just to see what their intentions are around those. Clearly, education school funding is for children that are in school at the moment, and we recommend that schools retain a healthy balance between that 5 to 8%. But if it's going above that, the question is, how is that pupil funding being used now to support children in school? So we will do that with the small number of schools where they're over. Number of schools in deficit reduced down to 19, and we outlined a bit of the kind of work that we've been doing there with schools across the county. It's me that's heavily involved in that, if I'm honest. And of the schools that are in deficit and the ones that are potentially at risk, at the moment, there are really good plans in place for the majority of those. I think there are 2 that we would deem to be higher risk and are working harder with to try and work through resolutions around exactly how we get those balances back under control. But the majority of schools are in a good place in terms of their recovery there. The key reasons around deficit at the moment tend to be pupil numbers. So APS was hit quite hard during the pandemic. And actually, I think if you've read the SEND Green Paper, you'll note that one of the things they're looking at within the Green Paper is how they ensure that alternative provision funding is a bit more stable moving forward, because it is very responsive to a kind of level of need around exclusion, and that affected them. So there was an issue for the APS around those pupil numbers, but also particularly our primary schools, the smaller primary schools, are still quite volatile to small changes in pupil numbers. And there's a couple of schools where their admission numbers are not helping in terms of trying to get a balanced position in place. But overall, we've been able to work with the majority of schools to get to a good place. And like I say, there are 2 that we're working with more intensively than the rest to try and get back to a point where we can see a plan for recovery. So that was that section. There was more detail in the report. Again, I kind of leave it open to ask if there's any questions, comments, or thoughts around any of that. take that as I can't see anything coming up. Andrew, you haven't seen anything? No. Okay. Well, I mean, overall, I think it's a positive picture. So I guess we're pleased how that's moving forward. I'm going to hand over to Sue Hall around the children and families summary out turn, if that's okay.
Okay, thanks, Phil. Yeah, just a few highlights or lowlights, as you might see, of the children and families outturn position for 21-22. I think, as we were discussing in January, significant overspends during the year have led to a 17.2 million overspend. Some of that we've identified as really COVID related, about 9.6, giving us about a 7.6 underlying overspend. Majority of that overspend, I suppose, there's two areas, with the most significant being external placements at 15 million, and is linked to the rise in the number of children in care. As you can see, between April 2020 and the end of the year, we were placing, or we had children in care additional of 87. And when you've got a cost of over 116k per placement, you can see how the total adds up. In addition, we've also most probably are now taking more placements in through external market than we are through our in-house services. So that again increases the overspend on these services. And as we speak, the latest figures are that the children in care are now 800. I think it's 860, just over 860. So significant pressure continues within that area. We have got additional funding within the council budget for 22-23 of 6 million. But again, there's going to be continued pressure on that area. The other area to mention is the services for children with disabilities, which were overspent by 1.6 million. Very similar costs, just the number of young people we're now supporting. Some of those are very complex and need additional support, particularly through some of the health facilities, which we get recharged for, as well as some disability staffing and agency costs. Clearly, the council has got a number of areas where we're looking to be able to sort of address the position that is ongoing, really. And as you can see, there's 4 points linked there. Developing the edge of care offer, so we try and prevent children coming into care. And developing, a lot of the next two are about developing our in-house provision. If the market out there's so much demand for placements at the moment, it's very difficult to get an appropriate placement or any placement at all. So the strategy is to look to provide more in-house fostering, and there's been investment in that area, as well as into our own supported living and residential provisions. The final point there, just to pick up again about ensuring that where we have got children in care, is ensuring the permanence planning is in place and there's no drift and delay in making sure children get to the placements they need in a timely manner. So those are some of the key highlights from the outturn report. Thanks, Phil.
Okay. Thank you, Sue. Does anybody have any questions for Sue about that summary outturn report? Okay, thank you very much. Phil, I think it's back to you for high needs.
Yeah, just work out how to unmute myself on WebEx again. Okay, so the high needs report. So I said I'd go through this in a little bit more detail. So detailed the end of year position for 21-22. So just when looking at this table, so if we look at the bottom there, the high needs unallocated line, that was effectively where we started the year. So that 4,093,000 was what we were hoping would be our in-year deficit. I mean, we would have liked it to have been less, to be clear, but going into the year, that's where we expected to be. We ended up in the bottom right-hand corner there with 6.961. overspend on high needs. So we moved by about 2.9 million. That's quite a significant shift. Over the last few years, we've been much tighter around this forecasting. We've been setting a deficit budget and being able to get relatively close to that, showing an understanding of what's happening around the trends and what we might expect to happen throughout the year. That was more challenging this year. There were a number of movements, so I've picked them out on this. On this, they're in some of the details in the report, but I've picked out the kind of key movements here. So AP, just linking to that point about actually the challenge they faced in terms of deficits, AP underspent quite significantly this year, 622,000. That was because there was a reduction in the need for places throughout the year. There's a legacy there from some of the COVID situation with children not being in school. It was second half of the year that's reverted much more to normal. So we've seen expenditure in the second half of last year much more in line with what we might have expected. But overall, a net underspend in that area. The biggest movement by quite some way was in post 16, colleges and FE. And so this is post 16 provision outside of the kind of special school or mainstream secondary post 16 provision that supports children with EHCPs. So Gloucestershire, SGS, etc., the colleges across the county, and some kind of national star, the kind of private providers that also work in the county. 1.4 million over. It's quite significant numbers. We saw an increase there. It's twofold, really. One is that we're starting to see the flow through of the continual rise in EHCPs through the mainstream. And I'll come to the EHCP data in a minute, but there was data in there that shows the majority of requests come through primary, some through secondary as well. It's not exclusively primary, but some through secondary. And what we're seeing now is a flow through of all of that those years of increases coming out into post 16 now as well. So we've got a 1.4 million overspend there. I would say the second part to that, so there were two things. The second part to that is we've been doing a lot of work. We ran a transition chat program around post 16, and the impact of the work we've been doing around supporting children who might become NEET, not in employment, education and training, has been good. And we've seen some real good progress in that area. Unfortunately, that comes with a cost, and because they're staying in employment, educational training, in this position education, we're seeing a rising cost into that post 16. I think this is a trend we're going to continue to see, and I'll come back to that in a second. The primary and secondary mainstream top-ups were overspending, 687,000 on the primary and 484 on the secondary. So that's overspending above what we forecast. And so the forecast was based on the growth trends we've seen over the last 2, 3, 4 years. So we're using trends in growth to forecast. What that's showing is that those trends have gone up during the last 12 months. And again, in the EHCP data that I provided, you'll see the nature of that. We're seeing more requests for education, health and care plans. Therefore, those budgets came under more pressure. So both of those two, it's just over £1 million between them there. We're up. Excuse me. The 322,000 over on independent placements. Again, that's a spill through of those higher numbers. We've had to increase the number of independent special school places. Being totally honest, with the increasing number of EHCPs that we've had, and the need for places, I think that's actually a positive level. I think in years gone by that might have actually been significantly higher, and I would say a particular thanks to the special schools and to those that have responded to try and make sure we're able to meet the needs of children without having to go into the independent market to do that. It is an overspend, but actually I think that could have been significantly higher without the support that's been received around that. And that links to the point below, which is that the special school provision was up and overspent by 864,000. And ultimately, I guess the point there is, if it wasn't overspending in this area, it would have been in the independent sector, and it therefore would have been more costly. Again, rising numbers of EHCPs coming through the system has driven this. I think the post-16 and FE is a consequence of years of that. The rest of it is a consequence of a rise in the trend this year in requests for EHCPs, even above and beyond what we were seeing before, which was high anyway. So that was the kind of overall position there. I might just go through the EHCP data as well, just to finish that bit off, just so that we can do that, and then I'll come back to any kind of comments or questions. So this table you'll have seen in the report, and I use it quite a lot in the reports. This shows the current number of EHCPs being maintained in the county. We're now at 5,004, and the progression throughout the year this year has been high. I included a number of kind of its detail around this. You can see just the reference there about where the plans are being issued. So this graph, which again was in the report, shows where those requests and the plans are being issued. So ages 5 to 10 is the dominant area there where we're seeing requests. And of course, that means more often than not, those plans are supporting them through quite a bit significant chunk, if not all of their education. So the fact that that's happening fairly early, and actually when you look at under fives as well, and that's an area where you can see the dominant part of our requests are coming in those early parts of their education, with it tailing off later as we go through, which you might expect, but I think the variation there is quite high. This other chart was just trying to show against the post-16, the narrative around the post-16 actually. So it shows on the axis going up, it shows the age of pupils that are in current receipt of an EHCP. And what you can see obviously is that we've got, and it will have increasing numbers going into post-16 over the coming years, because we've got larger numbers in the secondary school age range here. So there's quite a big spike, and in terms of planning for high needs for next year, we've made assumptions around what that might look like. So I think we're expecting to see a continued rise in the need for post-16 support, and we've got that kind of significant uplift in numbers. I put a couple of the kind of details of numbers in there. So last year, if you look at the 2021, this is the academic year, there are 820 requests for statutory assessment. That was up from 695 the previous year, and you can see where that's been trending upwards. And I guess the question is, at what point that trend we might start to see that going in a different direction. It's not this year, because 667 was when I produced this report that's up. We're expecting the numbers to be over 900 by the end of this academic year, the requests for EHCPs. I have to say, I haven't got the data, but we are starting to see more refusal to assess, increases in refusal to assess and refusals to issue at panel. However, when those go through appeal and tribunal, the success rate is very low. From perspective, and nationally, 96% of EHCPs that go in any shape or form through to tribunal nationally are found in favour of parent, carer, and family. So very, very few find in favour of the local authority provision there. The final bit just to note on this data was, I just wanted to flag the increasing trend in requests from parents and carers. I think it's interesting that and I mentioned this at the working group, for those that were in the high needs working group, we are starting to, or have been seeing, a rising trend in requests coming from parents and carers. And you can see the percentage there in 21-22 is quite high. We're talking 37-38% of requests coming from parents and carers. That's moved up significantly over the years. And I think one of the things you'd note is that that's the percentage of requests. The actual overall number of requests has gone up as well. So the volume of requests coming from parents and carers is significantly up. So there's a volume increase and a percentage of requests there coming from parents and These trends are still, like I said, they're still continuing. We're monitoring this year, but we think it'll come in at around about 900 and something requests to assess for any HCP. That makes setting a balanced budget, as you can imagine, very, very difficult. We'll come on to that in a second. I'm going to pause there and just see if there's any questions or comments on any of that before I move on to some of the things that are now happening, and see if anybody's got anything they want to kind of ask or add around that conversation.
Phil, can
I think Victoria's first, I think. Is it Victoria?
Yes. I'm just like to hear a little bit more, Phil, about the comment on the increasing trend in requests from parent and carers, and it's something that's come up quite frequently. I'd say almost in every bit of contact that goes out to schools, early years settings, and to those parents who get updates because they've subscribed to the GCC website for SEND and the HCPs. There's reference to this, but there's doesn't go anywhere else. What is the point you're making? We keep hearing it and I keep seeing it and reading it, but I don't quite get the point you're making.
I think the only point I'm making is that there is a rising level of requests coming from that part of the I was going to say the sector then, but it's a change in the trend. I think we are doing some work to try and understand exactly what the detail behind all of that, and whether there are things we can do. I'm not saying there's necessarily anything directly that we should be or can do to respond to that, because ultimately parents and carers are perfectly entitled to make a request for an EHCP. I think I would say it's a byproduct of the changes that were made to the code of practice back in 2014-15, which was looking to try to put more emphasis on parent voice and etc. in that process. And I think I'd say it's been from this data, it's been really successful. It is an interesting dynamic, because we would still expect to see, I think, the majority of requests coming from schools in conjunction with parents and carers. So I think it is an area we want to understand more. I think it's a fair challenge that we need to get underneath that data and really understand exactly what that means, and whether there are things we should be looking to do around this. It'd be unfair for me to comment on it more than that without a bit more of a bit investigation, I think.
No, that's absolutely fair enough. And I just felt, having seen it so many times, that I wanted to raise it here, and I'm pleased to hear that you're looking to unpick it a bit more, because there needs to be a clear strategic response to why this is happening. And obviously you need an understanding. The pandemic, I think, is going to be, just anecdotally on the engagement with the number of parents I'm having who are doing these themselves, it's the information they need to put forward that EHCP request for an assessment. Quite often the schools haven't got it because the children haven't been there enough. It'll be interesting to see if it continues now, but certainly the understanding of where assessment requests are coming from at the levels we've got them and the financial impact it's going to have, we need to understand better so we can have a strategy. And on a communication point, just referencing requests from parent and carers isn't going down too well with parents and carers.
And that's fair enough.
Okay, thank you. Lynn.
I'd like to know the cost to the LA of I'm sure there's not an average tribunal, but of a tribunal, just in terms of legal fees and manpower. And also, this is obviously a national issue, not a local issue. What's Gloucestershire doing to join up with any national campaigning bodies to get the high needs budget increased?
Okay, so there was two things there, wasn't there? I think if you don't mind, I'll take the first one away as an action. I have got a number in my head, but it would be good for us to just double check and make sure that we're really clear that that's a number. It's an expensive process. It takes a lot of time and resource. I think we were pleased, I think, to see in the green paper, recognition that that part of the system isn't working well, and that they were looking at mandatory mediation and different models to try and look at how they can prevent so many cases nationally having to go through that tribunal process, because as I guess you're alluding to, it's an expensive thing. But I'll take that as an action and get the detailed breakdown of the cost there for you, if that's okay. Around the second part, so in terms of tackling this nationally, I think we'll come on to it in a second. We're involving ourselves in the DfE delivering better value and send program. So we're going to work with the DfE and a range of other local authorities in that program. We've included details of that in the pack. It's the initial information. I think what it does show you is there's 55 LAs involved in that program, and there are and that safety valve program is for the higher levels of deficit, and there were 6 on that safety valve program the previous years, I believe. So somewhere in the region of 20 in the safety valve program. That's 75 LAs involved in this the DfE programs around trying to get better value. So when we talk about national issue, you can see there that that's a significant slice of the LAs across the country. So I think engaging through that program is a good route to work with the DfE and other LAs to look at this and around a kind of common program, a common framework. You'll see in there they talk about kind of a common approach to analytics, etc. That I think will certainly help. Through the F40, and again, probably would have touched on this a bit later, but through the F40, we are looking at how we influence this a bit more. The executive group of the F40, I've provided a bit of a table at the end, and I'll come to that later. But we're looking at the equity of funding around high needs and the challenges we face in that landscape, and how we can, as a group, influence that, but also how they can work with the F40 agency can work with others, ADCS, LGA, potentially unions, others, etc., to look at the kind of common and core messages around this. I think there is a concern that at the moment there's a lot of LAs fighting this battle individually. The safety valve program, exactly that. There's a direct conversation looking to resolve those individual issues in each LA, and we do need national change. The green paper is a good starting point for some framework around that. But I guess it's a green paper, and we need to see what comes out of that in terms of actual policy. The idea of national standards and national banding system, those things all sound great, but we need to see how that comes into actual policy, and then the implementation timelines around those things. So I think we're working with from a number of different angles on this. I guess I'd be really keen to understand whether colleagues around the table feel there are other mechanisms that could be used to kind of influence around this. And one thing I would say is that the message coming from schools and early years providers tends to be stronger when it's coming from the system rather than necessarily from the local authority, because you're the ones that have got these kids in school day-to-day basis. So I think if there are other things we could be doing, or that we feel as a group we could be doing, I'd be really keen to hear them. Sorry, that was a long answer. No, that's okay.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions, or does anybody want to come back on anything that Phil just said? No? Okay, thank you very much. Phil, high needs activity now?
Yeah, so the activity, I mentioned the DfE Delivering Better Value and Send program, really keen to be involved in, like I said, really keen to be involved in that. We're in the second wave. I think if you've read the papers, you'll notice we're in the second wave of that. And it's a relatively longish process with a 6-month starting point around the analytics, and then an 18-month look at the implementation and the kind of action plan as such. I guess given the other things that are going on, so the inclusion and SEND strategies, which I've referenced again on the slide, those are going through Cabinet later this month for approval. I've included a couple of things on the slide there about some of the things that we're proposing. I guess what I'm really keen to see is in that process of delivering better value in SEND programme, alongside what we're doing in terms of our current strategies around SEND and inclusion, and and what comes out of the SEND green paper. What are the gaps? What are the things that we're not currently looking at that we should be? I think I've spent a lot of time in this landscape looking at the kind of high needs pressures and challenges at the moment, and there aren't easy solutions. Is the short answer from our side. It feels like we're doing many of the right things. There's good alignment between what we're saying in our current strategies and what's said in the green paper. The development of alternative provision, considering that to be more innovative and working in earlier intervention, and we've started that process. That's already underway, and we've been doing more of that this year. The move to a kind of common banding system, which hopefully will come nationally, but we're doing that locally. I wanted to flag the kind of non-statutory. We are, I guess, technical term, lighting a bit of a fire under that to try and get a model together to look at how we can provide non-statutory funding to the system, hopefully for September. So Amanda Henderson and the SEN team are currently looking at models of best practice around that, and hopefully getting in place a system where we can provide non-statutory funding to allow earlier intervention, to, I guess, hopefully provide more confidence, and it might be an answer to Victoria's question, more confidence to parents and carers that there are mechanisms for support above and beyond the EHCP, that the EHCP isn't a panacea to all things around SEN. So providing that non-statutory funding, these are things that reflect what are in the green paper. We would like to see national standards. We think that's a really good step forward, and we're hopeful that will progress. The other bit we've flagged on I think is around workforce development and the commitment to work to look at how we support the development skills and expertise in the system. It's a people business. It's people working with children, and the skills and expertise those people have on a day-to-day basis are really important. When we talk about early intervention, it's really important that the people that are working with with children and young people have the skills, the expertise to be able to identify needs at the earliest possible opportunity, and to be able to respond them and support them. There's more detail laid out in the inclusion and SEND strategies about what we're proposing. There are 2 strategies there, but there will be one implementation plan, which I'll bring back to the next meeting in September. Like I said, some of the things are already underway and have been for some time. Other elements of it are kind of new and will come over the next few months. So that's the activity. I don't know whether anyone wants to comment or say anything about any of that before I go on to this year's budget.
I don't think so, Phil.
Okay. So the eagle-eyed amongst you, hopefully you can see this on the screen. If you can't, it's in your pack, so you might need to. I'm really sorry, I couldn't get it on any bigger than that. If you can't see it, it's in the pack. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed there's a slightly different format to this, and this will be the format we're trying to use moving forward. Tried to break down some of the budgets in a little bit more detail, so I'll just kind of mention those in a second. But we're also this is also part of a piece of work that I think Chris Hemingway, who's on the call, alongside Sue in our finance team, have been working on to develop the kind of ongoing 5-year budget. I haven't included the 5-year element at this stage, just this year's. We will bring the 5-year plan back to the next meeting, but we want to make sure that's all fine-tuned and really right before I start putting numbers out into the system around what it might look like over the next 4 to 5 years. We've broken it down to a bit more detail. I think the top elements there, the mainstream EHCP top-ups you'll recognise. Special centres, those are the resource bases attached to primary and secondary. I don't think we've shown that in that detail before. Special school provision, we've broken it down by the LA funded place funding. Those are maintained LA special schools. Place funding ESFA, so that's the recoupment for academy special schools. So you can see the balance there in terms of place funding between LA and LA maintained and academies, and the special school top-up funding as an overarching amount there. The independent special schools were broken down into two parts. I think I've touched on this previously. We've always reported independent special schools as a whole. We've got joint funded placements and the LA 100% funded. So the difference there, the joint funded are the very complex placements that tend to be residential and will often, the education element of it will be a small part of what is a very sizable package of support for a child in potentially an independent provision anywhere in the country, frankly, a Gloucestershire child. So those are the very high cost places. The reality is that's not a part of the budget we necessarily feel we can influence through early intervention. These are some of our most complex and challenging, supporting some of our most complex and challenging children in the county. The LA 100% are those day placements in independent provision. That is where I guess we would hope over time and have continued to hope over time that we can reduce the use of independent provision and increase our specialist, increase capacity in our own special provision. So broken that down there. Again, EHCP college, the top-ups for colleges and FE, that's the same as previously. Alternative provision and the hospital education service, the recoupment for excluded pupils, that's money that comes back in to high needs when pupils are excluded. It's the all-PU funding that the mainstream schools get that's recouped. LA services and staffing, again, that's the same as it previously has been, restorative practice. We've separated out the special school teacher pay and pension grant there just so you can see the amount there. LA support services, again, therapies and other related costs separately. And then our independent school commissioning budget there, which is a small amount. The high needs unallocated is often used as the line to kind of identify where our kind of our deficit level is expected to be. So tried to break it down. I'm going to continue to use this kind of format if we can moving forward. It links to, like I said, links to a 5-year plan. Overall, what we've done, so I've tried to show here the change between 21-22 and 22-23. So you can see the uplift effectively in compared to the outturn in that last year. So we've got an uplift in mainstream EHCP costs, primary, secondary, post-16 early years. Those have all been uplifted or proposed to be uplifted based on a 3% increase to top-ups. I'll come back to that in a second, alongside coming back to the proposed 7% uplift for top-ups for special school top-up funding. So you've got an uplift there from 14 million last year to 15.1 this year. That would be based on the same number of places effectively, but an increased top-up amount based on a 7% uplift. And then we've modelled a significant uplift in EHCP costs for post-16 again. That's to effectively replicate what we saw happening this current year, a significant increase in the need for colleges and FE places. Now, it's quite a significant movement, but we feel it's probably realistic based on what we experienced this year and the number of pupils leaving year 11 with an EHCP. So it's something based on kind of existing data, that one. Just picking up on the kind of summary sections below, this shows the income and the kind of deficit position as proposed. I just picked out the kind of increase in funding for the DFE-SFA. So that is an increase as part of the funding that was provided in the comprehensive spending review. They allocated additional funding to high needs. We've received another 6.4 million this year to support the challenge. I've identified the supplementary grant separately because we received the supplementary grant and with very clear message around making sure that was used to support rising costs that schools are seeing, the health and social care levy, amongst other things. I think experiencing rising costs at the moment. So the cost of heating and electric and stuff like that in schools is obviously going up. So that supplementary grant was there to support that 2.9 million in the income section. When we take all of this and those kind of proposed changes, and those are the significant ones, I guess. The proposed uplifts and the increase in funding, etc., assuming similar trends to last year in terms of the rising numbers of EHCPs, we think we're coming in at 4% spent this year. That is the proposed deficit budget for this year. So we're expecting it to be down on last year, where we were 6.9 over, so it's an improvement. But we treat that with a degree of caution because what we are seeing at the moment in the system is incredible fluctuation in those numbers. If we see further spikes in numbers, that 4.8 will go up. If we see more children coming out of year 11 into post 16 than we're expecting, we will see those go up. But the current with all of the modelling and all of the kind of understanding the data we've got at the moment, we think that's where we're going to come in, and that creates that cumulative position in the bottom right hand corner, 25.6. I can see a hand's gone up. I was going to stop there and ask for questions. So,
Dave? You might be on mute, Dave. No, you're not.
Hello?
Hello, David.
Hello.
We can hear you now.
Off and on. Brilliant IT. So thank you. I commend you, Phil, for the level of detail. Thank you. First time I've seen it in this format, so it's really helpful. I've got a couple of simplistic questions, which are probably blindingly obvious, but mainstream uplifted by 3% and elsewhere by 7%. I don't understand the differential or the rationale for the differential. It's probably blindingly obvious, but I don't understand it.
So the mainstream, well, there were 2 uplifts already into mainstream funding. So the minimum funding levels went up when the national funding formula came through, and there is a supplementary grant income also going direct into mainstream. So there were already 2 uplifts into mainstream core funding. We didn't want to, if I'm honest, thought long and hard about whether we were able to uplift this, but what was intended within the supplementary grant was that all schools where the children with EHCPs, so from high needs, get that kind of minimum of 3% uplift. So that 3% reflects the high needs supplementary grant that we received and an increase to top up to mainstream through that. The 7% represents 2 things. One, firstly, that 3%, secondly, a 4% uplift to core funding because they haven't had those other 2 uplifts that the mainstream have already received in minimum funding levels and in the kind of wider supplementary grant. So the reason for a higher increase in specialists was effectively that mainstream had already received additional funding through other avenues. Does that make sense, Dave?
It does. I'll have to go back and check how much I'm getting, but yeah, absolutely.
I can answer the question now. It's not enough if that's what.
Yeah. Well, you'd be surprised if I didn't check. The other thing is you talked about the increase needed post 16 with the EHCPs. Completely recognise that, and you've modelled and uplifted for colleges and FE, but actually decreased post 16 for mainstream.
Yeah, so it's based on the data. So what we're seeing is less children coming out of year 11 in mainstream into post 16 this year, and that's based on what we're seeing with the numbers of year 11 with an EHCP leaving secondary this year. It's slightly less than last year, but it's much higher in specialist and independent sectors. So overall, we're expecting the majority of that to be in the college and FE part of the sector, rather than staying on in mainstream post-16 provision. It'd be interesting to see if that plays out. That's what the data's telling us at the moment.
Okay, I'd be surprised from our own personal circumstances, because we're seeing an increase. Go on.
Well, it'll be interesting to see whether that balance, and part of the reason for breaking these things down in more detail is so that we can see those variations as they come throughout the year. It may be that we see a slight shift in that, but that's what it's telling us at the moment.
Sorry, and then only two more. There are uplifts sort of throughout, which I sort of understand the rationale behind that. But just to clarify, for instance, the uplift in local services and virtual school and things like that, is that percentage-wise in relation to inflation? Is it increase in staff costs? What's
so
that?
There are two things. There was one thing I actually forgot to mention. So yes, there are inflationary increases in there around staff costs and all those things, and use of the supplementary grant and the pay and pension grants as well. So that's virtual school. That's what that is. The support services one actually currently includes, that isn't a pure uplift. And what I will do for the next meeting is separate that out. Within the support services, we've currently got a range of support packages for things like education other than at school, exceptional kind of funding packages for children that are either not on a school roll, children missing education, that kind of thing. That is to the tune of 1.1 million. It's currently been moved into that support services line. It wasn't in there last year, and we're going to separate. Sue and I have discussed it earlier this morning. I'm going to separate it out so you can see that separately next time. But where there are LA services and staff, there are no increases in terms of staffing numbers, etc. It's all inflationary and pay progression, etc., as it would be in the rest of the sector.
I just think that would be important to put in the notes, because when I read through the notes, that uplift in random inflation and things like that, commentary isn't in there. And then one observation: restorative justice is down. Now I understand it's a council of perfection to try and do that. It just seems a little bit unusual to reduce restorative justice.
It didn't reduce the budget. It was £4,000 overspent last year. The budget stayed the same. They were just £4,000. That's the outturn from last year, not the budget.
Okay.
So they're slightly. We're trying to make sure it's within budget this year. That's what that is. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Dave. Victoria, you're on mute, Victoria.
Oh, that's better. Just so I can be absolutely clear, Phil, given what you said about the increases in requests for EHCPs, including those requested by parents and carers, and the fact that I think you said 96% nationally of appeals are overturned in favour of the child and the family rather than local authorities. So potentially a huge rise in the number of EHCPs. How does this budget account for that? Because
So it's effectively all of the areas that are likely to be affected. Those where the effectively looking back at trends. So what we've done from last year is take the growth trends from last year and modelled that moving forward for this year, effectively looking at that kind of, I think it was whatever the data was on the chart, was 800 and something, 820 increase requests. It's likely to be 900. So we've based it on that trend. But in the financial model, there is a kind of, and I can share more of this information in the next meeting if you think it's useful. There is detail around the proportion of children and young people within EHCP and where they effectively end up educated in the county, whether there's a proportion in mainstream, proportion in specialists, etc. So we've modelled those numbers and we're looking at against the kind of proportion of where they're likely to end up, and that's why each of these budgets, so that's why special school places are going up, because we know that we're going to see an increase in the need for more special school places. We've got the new special school opening as well, which hopefully will help. But you can see mainstream uplifts as well around, particularly around the primary uplift there, because the significant rise in numbers that we see in that area. So it's modelled based on the historic trends. The reality is that's the way funding is provided as well. It's very difficult because you need to be able to respond based on need. And like I said earlier, the need fluctuates. Looking at the data we've got, I think this is as close as we can get to kind of sensible assumption around what we might expect to see this year, albeit, 2 years ago, we didn't know we were going to have a pandemic and the impact that would have. At least we'll be able to report against where we think the variations in the system are.
And sort of as a aside to that, thinking of particularly the group of families right now who have made their requests, whether themselves or with their school or setting, or are about to, given the challenges in getting to the point where they actually have the EHCP, i.e. we've hardly got any ed psychs, we are in a bit of a crisis, how in processing and missing deadlines, how does this budget plan for that crisis that the service is in our county right now?
So, first thing I would say is not just in our county, I would say nationally, all of those things you've just referenced are national situations. The fact that you can't find an EP anywhere at the moment is a national issue as well as a local one. Very, very difficult to recruit to. There's been a communication that's come out recently from Amanda Henderson, lead on SEN, I think clearly stating that we will, if we go over the 20 weeks, which I think what you're alluding to there is there have been delays in meeting the statutory timelines. If we go over those 20 weeks, we will be backdating the funding to the point of when that should have been completed. The reality, and that's what the budget is assuming. So the delays as process, we're clear that they shouldn't affect the funding and the support that people get. So it's modelled within this to do that. Does that answer your question?
It does. And then just, sorry, one last little one. With regard to the non-statutory funding that you've talked about, Amanda Henderson and her team looking into as to try and support children before they would need an EHCP, where is that in this budget?
So it would fit within that. I just talked about that kind of support services element.
Okay.
So there's two parts. There's an element in there, but the other part to that is that what we would expect to happen as a consequence of providing non-statutory funding is a reduction in the number of EHCP requests. And the reality is we're not refusing to assess children because or refusing to issue a plan and going to tribunal because we think that's what we want to do. The advice, all of the specialist expertise is telling us an EHCP is not required to support that child accessing education. If we can provide support around a non-statutory, we would hope to see that offset. So elements of it would also come from within the actual top-up budgets. We'd expect to see those reduce and the non-statutory elements increase. I'll be really clear, the idea of non-statutory funding is not as a precursor to an EHCP. The idea is that it is there to support a short-term level of need that we don't have to wait, a minimum of 20 weeks, but I think as you're alluding to, sometimes longer. We don't have to wait that period of time to get a statutory plan to provide additional support, that we can do it in a much more flexible, agile way, meet those needs and allow that child to progress on their education without the need for long-term statutory support. So it's not a pathway. So I might say that again in a minute as well, just to make it clear.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
Cheers.
Thank you. Poppy, I'll come to you in a minute. Suzanne, is your comment a direct response to what Phil's just been saying?
Yeah, just to clarify, Phil is right. We have built the EP, the pressures that are in the EP service, but EPs are funded from our GCC funded accounts and not from dedicated schools grants, just to clarify that. But we are have invested in the current year, and we'll be looking to invest further in forthcoming years in that service. So yes, we are modelling it in, but it's not in this budget.
Yeah, so the EP service, 100%. What is worth saying, I think, is it is really hard to, whilst we can put money into that, there are a number of specialist roles at the moment that are incredibly difficult to recruit to. Health, will say, mental health workers in CAMS, education psychologists, even social workers, etc. There is a real demand around those specialist roles across the country, and we're seeing that reflected here. Sorry.
Okay, thank you. Poppy.
Yeah, hi. Mine's I know we're discussing high needs, but mine's more sort of general about this actual budget. The fact that we're going into a cumulative deficit of 25 million. What is the long-term strategy on this deficit? Is this the sort of where we can discuss this? Because it seems we're just sort of brushing over the fact this deficit is getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope it didn't feel like we're brushing over it. I mean, I think just going back to the kind of previous points around the delivering better value and send, the kind of the strategies, what we're focusing on is trying to get earlier intervention in place, reduce the escalation of need coming through the system. If we can do that, we affect the numbers and we reduce the number of children needing longer term, more higher cost levels of support. Reality is that 91% of this budget at the moment goes out to support children with an EHCP or those that have been excluded from school. So there aren't loads of things in terms of service areas, or it's not an area where you can look at and say, right, we can cut. There's something here we can stop doing or cut back from. Now, this year we're proposing, because we got the supplementary grant, we're proposing those uplifts to 3% and 7%. Now that's nearly £2 million worth of additional funding. You might argue, with a £4.8 million in-year deficit, why are we doing that? Well, the reality is twofold. One, we've been given that money as a supplementary grant to invest and to make sure schools are getting the uplifts that they need. But also, if we don't do it, the reality is mainstream schools won't be able to meet need for children. Special schools won't be able to meet needs of children, and we see them escalating up and down throughout the system. So the strategy and the focus has been on earlier intervention. There are, I think I've touched on this previously, and it might have been in meetings before you're involved, Poppy. But it's not the early intervention isn't a panacea, and it's a long-term game, and it potentially doesn't affect the level of funding here that we're talking about. The current levels, we're starting this year, and we will have spent most of the budget before we've even started. So the uplifts of new plans, etc., are all incremental on top of something we've already spent at the start of the year. So that's going to continue. The idea that these EHCPs will all of a sudden there'll be a massive cessation in them, and we'll see huge numbers starting to drop. It's not necessarily. It's not, because we're seeing them rise at the moment, and once they're in the system, that they're there. So at the moment, we have to continue to focus on early intervention. We have to continue to deliver what we're trying to do around AP. We have to get the right number of special school places in to reduce the higher cost placements. At the same time, we have to have those conversations I think Lynn was alluding to earlier about how do we engage with national policy and the national issue around this, because fundamentally, I don't know whether me.
You're breaking up, Phil.
Still there? Am I? Can you?
Oh. Yes.
Yeah.
Maybe try turning your video off, Phil.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, heard that bit.
Okay. I don't know what, I'm not sure. I will try and start my video, but I
You're
might
back
stop
now.
sharing the screen.
It's fine now.
Okay. I don't know where you lost me now.
About the national picture and
Guess
about
what? The point I'm trying to, yeah, point I'm trying to make here is that we're doing the right thing locally. Earlier, the approach around earlier intervention, that making sure we're getting the right funding in to support earlier, adapting models around AP, around our specialist provision to make sure we've got the right specialist support available in the county at the lowest possible cost. We're doing that, but what we also need to see is national change, because this is a national issue. Some of that is around investment, but some of it is also around the proposed changes in the SEND Green Paper around national standards, consistency of approach, strengthening that tribunal process. At the moment, if somebody wants to access an EHCP, reality is they through that process at the moment, we pretty much have to grant what's requested. We have had instance recently where people have been asking for support for a child or young person that would be £60,000 to £70,000 more than we would expect. Residential provision where we wouldn't normally expect to provide residential provision. And the reality is we lose that case in tribunal. We lost one recently that will cost £270,000 over 3 years, where we didn't feel we didn't feel residential provision was needed, but it was at tribunal agreed that it would be. So our levers to influence these things need to be able to change, and that national SEND Green Paper touches on some of these issues, but it is going to be a long-term process. This it isn't short-term.
okay.
Did that all come across? Did that all come across? I'm conscious my screen's gone crazy. Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine, Phil. Thank you. Is that all right, Poppy? Yeah. Okay, thank you. Phil, there's a couple of requests.
Recommendations.
Okay, recommendation. Okay, so there are 3 recommendations there. So it's the 3% increase to mainstreaming HCP top-up funding, the 7% increase to special school top-up funding, and the planned deficit budget. Can I ask if there are any members of the forum who would oppose those recommendations?
Andrew, can I
Yes.
reserve judgment till I've had a look at what Phil said about supplementary and ARPU? Would that be all right?
I beg your pardon, sorry.
Okay, can I withhold what my vote at the moment while I have a look at supplementary and ARPU and then come back to you? Or does it have to be a definitive today?
No, it doesn't have to be unanimous. You could abstain from this.
Yeah, I'd like to do that. So
Okay.
just have a look at that
Right.
to fully understand it.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
Okay. So Dave Alexander will abstain from this. Is there anybody else who does not wish to support this at this stage?
I'd like to abstain, please, as well.
Okay. And Poppy as well. Anybody else at all? Joe, I think we can still say that School Forum approves this by a majority.
Yes, we can. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Right, so if that could be recorded, please.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Phil, it's back to the national picture, really, isn't it? About the inequity between various parts of the country.
So, well, there was a kind of F40 update. So I think we've shared details around the F40 campaign and things in previous meetings, and as an action from the last meeting, we shared some of the stuff as well. So the campaign's underway. There will be a briefing at Parliament to MPs coming up around funding issues, which will include the high needs and issues around national funding formula, etc. So there's all of the issues in that campaign we're taking to the House later this month. Well, sorry, early part of July, and there's a briefing there for MPs that's being undertaken. So that's the F40 group doing that, which involve. What I've included here is and I've shared this with in a couple of different forums in the past, but what I wanted to do was just kind of reiterate this point about equity of funding. This was I've said this in the report because I need to be really careful. This is a crude analysis of current high levels of high needs funding compared to Gloucestershire compared to other local authorities in the country. It wasn't done by us, it was done by the F40, and it was looking at the members of the F40 group. And basically what you can see there is the total number of mainstream pupils in the column in green, just after the LA name, and then a high needs block. And basically an average high needs block per pupil, how much per pupil funding each LA is getting per pupil. So if you take Gloucestershire, we've got 82,134 pupils, mainstream pupils on the data set as used at that time, and we're effectively receiving £84 million high needs block, effectively just about £1,026 per pupil. I've shown comparisons previously to Buckinghamshire, which are down the bottom there. They've got 75,000 pupils in the county, and they've got £111 million budget. If you look at, I guess, the one that I've identified there, which is Somerset, less pupils in the county, and slightly less budget as well, but on average, £1,116 per pupil coming through their high needs block. And we've got 1,026. That equates to a £7 million variance in funding. If we were to receive the same amount of funding as they were, we would be receiving £7 million a year. So this equity of funding issue is something that I want to raise. It's something that I've raised with the F40 and effectively asked for them, not us, because I think it's fair to do that as a kind of centralised group looking at this around equity issues in the funding landscape, to look at this in more detail, to understand it, to go beyond the kind of crude analysis, to look at this in a more detailed way and understand the issue itself. Now, there are a couple of non-F40 members referenced to the bottom there, which you can see Camden, Tower Hamlets. Obviously, there's a different context there. There's a London context. It's likely to be, average funding is going to be higher because of the average costs that they're likely to see. However, if you look at Camden's, they've got an average of £2,789 per pupil, a £7.5 million surplus last time I checked their schools forum report, and they're providing effectively the equivalent of the 1 in 40 for all schools, a top up of an additional increment of around 5,000 on top. So their funding is allowing them to do and provide a hell of a lot that we're not able to in Gloucestershire. And all I think we're saying at this point is that actually a small movement for us down this table would see us in a position where we wouldn't be setting a deficit budget and we would be in a position to recover. Now, again, I'm going to treat this with a degree of caution because I just want people to understand that this needs further work, but the effective issue behind this is the way in which the DSG was formed, and this is what our hypothesis is at this stage. So when the DSG in its current format was put together, the 4 blocks, effectively what you were moving from was a system where local authorities and school forums, I should say, have much more control over how funding was allocated. And you might decide at certain points to put more funding into mainstream schools to support children to access education in mainstream, or you might have decided as a local authority to invest more in specialist provision so that you had the special school places available to support children. It's effectively a decision around how you're balancing your funding across those schools part and the special school part of the system at the time. When they're formed into blocks, effectively, The high needs element is effectively constructed now. The high needs block is constructed on a 50% model. So 50% of the funding is based on historic funding levels around children with high needs, and that links to the special school element. So, if you were a system that spend local authority or an area that spent much more of your funding towards mainstream and trying to support mainstream inclusion, keep more children accessing mainstream, then your historic funding going into the high needs block would be lower. If you had and spent much more on specialist provision, have much more special school places, AP, etc., then your high needs block and the historic spending around high needs would have been higher. It links back to a 2017-18 number. Now, I raise it because it's something we're going to push forward, and this analysis needs, like I said, it needs more detail. That hypothesis needs working through and structuring into a kind of clear message around this. It is an issue we remain concerned about, and it reflects back on, I guess, the point Poppy was making earlier, which is about what do we do to affect this issue. This is one of the things that we are really focused on, is trying to make sure that there is an equity of funding across the country, as well as a kind of an approach from all LAs to try and make sure that we're keeping costs down. We're doing what the things we think are the right things, but we're still concerned at the moment we're not receiving an equitable level of funding compared to some authorities. Now, like I say, this is going to take some more detailed work across the next 6 to 8 weeks. But it is something that I'll bring back in September with a more detailed view of exactly what our proposals are around next steps. And when I say I do want this to be something that's considered by a kind of wider group, the F40, the LGA, the ADCS, whoever the right groups are to look at this, because it isn't, like I've said a million times, this isn't a Gloucestershire issue. This is a national issue that's created. We're by no means the lowest funded in that particular list when you compare to East Riding and Yorkshire, etc. So I wanted to raise it again to show that variation. This is something we are concerned about. It's not surprising that some LAs aren't in deficit when they're significantly higher funded. But as I said earlier, there are still 75 local authorities in the country as part of the kind of delivering better value for send or safety valve programs. So this is something I want to bring back here, but also I'm trying to get the F40 to spend more time focused on as a key campaign issue. As there comments or thoughts around any of that?
Phil, can I just ask? The 50% based on historical funding, I understand the inequities that result from that. The other 50%, is that based on some kind of analysis of need, or is it a purely numbers-based formula, or what?
I'm looking around whether Neil's there. He will be able to provide kind of more detail around this. But yeah, there's a needs-led element to the rest of the formula. So the idea is that it uses deprivation factors, the kind of things that are in the national funding formula to identify deprivation to do that.
There's a number of things like places in special schools. It includes an indicator of bad health, low prior attainment. So there's a number of proxy indicators, as Phil says, similar to what they would do with the national funding formula.
Okay, right.
There isn't one which is a measure of number of EHCPs.
Right.
That might end up being a question. So.
Right. Interesting. Okay, thank you. Okay. Phil, have you frozen and gone on mute, or? I think Phil's very still. I think probably we've reached the end of the high needs item on the agenda. Well, go back. Yes. Are you there, Phil? Okay. can I suggest that we move on to the review of the Constitution?
Yep.
Joe.
Yep, thanks, Andrew. So the current constitution is attached. This is reviewed annually at every June meeting of the forum. There have been no changes to the schools forum regulations or the good practice and operational guide, and therefore no changes are proposed at this time. There are also no changes proposed to the membership structure, which is outlined in the report also. So do members have anything they wish to raise, or I'm happy to answer any questions?
Anne-Marie.
Yep, thank you. Joe, I do have a question. It's about term of office, because in the Constitution it says that members' term of office is 4 years. But I've noticed those of us who've been elected apparently mid-term, we only have part of a term of office. And I just wanted to understand why that is, because certainly on our governing body, for example, if somebody replaces somebody else who finishes part of the way through their term of office, the new person starts a new 4-year term of office. They don't just finish the previous person's term, if you get my drift.
Yeah. So what it is, the schools forum elections take place every 2 years, and certain seats are kept within, they're allocated to each year's election. So,
okay.
Yeah, it's really just to make sure that we're not having like various elections after 4 years. So you take on the remainder of that 4-year term if you join mid-term.
Okay, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Does anybody else have any questions at all? Okay. So for the first recommendation, is there anybody who has any opposition to the current constitution, I guess? No. Okay, thank you. And again, any questions about the current membership structure or concerns about that? Okay, thank you. So Joe, I think the schools forum are happy with things the way they are.
Yeah, brilliant, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Phil, there was going to be an F40 update, but I don't know if you're able to do that. No?
It looks, yeah, can you see Phil, Andrew? I think he's still in.
No, I can see his tile, but there's no video.
Yeah.
I think it's just come back. Can you hear me now?
Oh,
Hear you.
you're back. You are back.
I miss WebEx.
Phil, is there anything about the F40 update you want to?
No, I touched on that. I touched on the Parliament stuff earlier in the. I mean, that's the next step, and it's the kind of key thing.
Okay.
Meeting at Parliament in July.
Okay, right. Thank you. So the meeting dates for next year are listed on the end of the agenda. So at 3:29, I think we can close the June meeting. There's a hand up.
Yeah, you'll be surprised to hear it's me, Andrew.
Yeah, sorry, I didn't see your name. I only saw the hand. Now I can see the name.
So I don't know if other people struggle with the volume of papers, but it might be my additional needs. We had a conversation under a long time ago. I don't know whether there is a way forward, whether there could be a précis or something like that. Build a PowerPoint today, great, love it, but I got it today. I absolutely understand that you need to share all of the context because it's probably going to get a cabinet and you've also got DFE monitoring and all of that kind of stuff and audit trails. Completely understand that. For somebody as inadequate as myself, I struggle with the volume of the paperwork, and I just wonder whether there could be a précis of different things, and here are the key decisions. Now, there's a danger that we'd all default to the précis and the key decisions, but it might be a better use of people's thinking time, and then I feel you might get a better response to your questions. I just feel I'm probably very unpopular with you now, but I just think it's, for me, I would really appreciate a précis and the key decisions to be made, so I could go and have a look at that, and then the PowerPoint, have a look at that as early as we possibly could, because that was really helpful from a personal perspective. And I apologise if it's only a personal perspective, but as I said yesterday in our meeting, here I am, Mr. Vocal.
Can I just say something? I understand what you're saying, and certainly if you printed everything off for this meeting, then that is a lot of paper. I wonder whether, I mean, for example, the family hubs service specification, which is 40 to 50 pages. I think the problem is that on Schools Forum, there may be people who are interested in the detail. And therefore, if there was a précis, people would be saying, well, I really need to see the full document. And I think that's a tricky balance, quite honestly. I'm
sorry to interrupt, Andrew.
No, go ahead.
I'm not asking for one at the expense of the other. I absolutely understand we need the full papers, and actually, where it's about something that I'm invested more than other areas. Sorry, being quite candid, then I do want that level of detail.
Right.
But
yeah.
I also want something to look at quickly. Right, here's the key. I need that level of detail before I can go back and make that decision. I'll read that section. So sadly, I did read all of the draft, which has got people's names in it, by the way, guys. I'm not sure whether that's supposed to be left in there or not, but I would just welcome both. And I know it means more work, but actually this is a critical forum and a critical decision-making forum. It does have to have the thinking time, and I'd rather do that than have a lot of time clattering through paper. Just a personal preference is what we do for governors at school, for instance. But not at the expense of the other one. Completely agree, Andrew.
Okay.
We need that. It's just that, sorry, I'll shut up.
Okay. Phil.
I was just going to say, can I suggest there's possibly a way we can structure putting them together that might help with that? So we can have a look at how we might be able to, how we can make sure that the key documents are clearly differentiated, and then those supporting documents around the specification, etc., separated out. I think that might help. So, because the point you make, Andrew, about the specification is right. It's a huge document, and it's right smack in the middle of it. Whereas the high needs report, I don't think is overly long. It's not intended to be. It shouldn't be, and it's the bulk of the conversation we've had today. So, I'm not sure how I'd précis that, and I'm certainly happy to provide slides earlier. Dave might be surprised to know that's just for me to be more organised on that a little bit earlier, but I can do that. That's not a problem.
Okay, thank you, Victoria.
Just to sort of second what Dave's saying, really, as an adult with quite significant special needs myself that impact my ability to access those documents, I find them incredibly overwhelming. And even something like the PowerPoint is, if we had that a bit earlier, sorry, Phil, it would really help me to
That's no problem.
access those documents in a way that at the moment they feel quite overwhelming. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything else from anybody else? Okay, well, thank you very much. If you get a summer break, I hope that you enjoy it, and we'll meet back again on the 15th of September. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Andrew.
Okay.
Can you end the live feed, Andrea, please?
Thank you.